If your system prompt for your AI agent is longer than 500 words, then this might not be the best solution to get a reliable answer. And I might have a better solution for you. Now, when you build an N8N agent that can do multiple things, like analyzing data or writing emails or formatting reports, then usually you would just dump all of these instructions into one big system prompt, right? Now, the problem with this is that the bigger the system prompt, the worse the agent will perform, right? So the LLM gets confused and costs go up, and you're basically shouting everything at once into this prompt or into the agent and hoping that it listens. Now, Skills fix this problem by flipping that logic. So instead of loading all of your instructions into that one system prompt, you will give the agent a list, a dedicated list of instructions and of skills that it has access to, and then it will be able to retrieve the relevant data and then to perform the according action by itself. So that when a task comes in, it goes through this whole list and then it picks the necessary skills it needs to perform that action. Now, the concept of skills was introduced by Anthropic, so the company behind Claude, and they have basically put out this very document, and I'm going to share the link in the description, which explains what skills actually are and how they work. However, the concept itself is quite easy because at the end of the day, a skill is just a folder, and this is going to contain certain types of files, where only the first one, which you see here, which is called skill.md, is the required one, and all of the other ones, like scripts, are all optional, so are references and assets, right? So what we're going to do today is to basically replicate the concept of skills within N8N, and just by using a simple Google Drive and a simple Markdown file just to get the concept across, so that you can basically rebuild skills within your N8N AI agents. So the way we are going to do this is that, first of all, we are going to jump into our Google Drive, and I am just going to create, or I already have created, 3 simple.md files, So what I'm going to do is to open these up and just to show you what these files contain. And by the way, you can get into the more, technical part if you want, for instance, into the core design principles and how these files and the folders are actually structured within that level system. But there is no need to do this within N8N necessarily, right? Because of the technical part that is within Claude, we're not going to rebuild this. So I'm going to jump into the Google Drive, and then let's just open this file. And here you can see that it's basically just a text document, and this is my YouTube to newsletter repurposer. And I have an overview here, and which just mentions that use this skill to turn a YouTube transcript into a newsletter edition that delivers value to email subscriber, right? And then a couple of keywords, and then the newsletter structure. So I'm giving it real thorough and detailed instructions, right? And this is something, and you can see this, right? That it is getting quite long. You even have a couple of sections and subsections. So imagine that this is only one skill that I want the agent to have, and if I wanted to put this into a system prompt, then this can get quite like fuzzy and not be as precise as having all of this information within the skill. All right, let's take a look into the second file. So this is a LinkedIn post writer, and this is just called LinkedIn post writer with the overview. Use this skill to turn any input into a LinkedIn post that feels human, gets engagement, and is formatted for the LinkedIn feeds. Then you have a couple of keywords and then the post structure itself, right? And again, this is quite detailed. So as you can see, this is already quite simple from a conceptual point of view, So let's jump into N8N and actually rebuild the agent that is able to retrieve these specific skills. All right, so I've opened up a new workflow within N8N, quite simple. We were going to start from scratch, and the first thing that I want to do is to use the chat trigger, and this is going to be triggered on chat event. I'm not going to add any options right here. I'm just going to keep them disabled. So the only thing that I want to use is the chat itself, right? So if I will click on open chat, then I do have this input field right here. And the next thing is already that I wanted to be able to search for the specific skill that are available, right? So that it basically conducts a search of all the skills that are within a specific directory, so that it basically knows, all right, what can I present to the subsequent agent as available skills, then to basically pass them on within the prompt to the agent itself. So I'm going to look for Google Drive, and this will be my very first note, and the one that I'm looking for will be to search for files and folders, right? So I'm going to open this up. It is already connected to my account. In the credentials field, the resource that I want to use is a file or a folder search. The operation is a search, and the search method will be to search file or folder name. Now, in regards to the search query, I'm just going to leave this blank for now, because what I want to do is that I am just going to add a filter right here on the bottom, and what I want to do is to look through the whole folder where I have stored all the available skills within, right? So there's not necessarily a search, because I just want to get all the skills, all the files from a specific directory, right? So what I'm going to do is to choose a specific folder, and then I'm going to look for the skills folder. And this is exactly what I'm being presented with. And if I jump back into my Google Drive, then you can see that this is this subdirectory right here. And then I can basically limit this to the amount of files, or I can just return all. Doesn't matter really now because I only have 3 files. And then I'm going to already execute this step just to see what happens. And let me just put in high so that the flow will be triggered. And now you can already see that I get 3 items. And if I open this up, then you can see on the right hand side in the table view that these are, judging by the name, exactly the 3 files that I have stored within my drive. Now, the next thing is that you might think that the next step would be to already add that agent, right? Because we now have access to those 3 files, and there might be 30 in there, right? And I now basically want to pass them on to the agent into the actual system prompt to tell it, all right, these are all the available skills in that specific directory. Use the one or download the one that you find appropriate for the according task, right? However, if I was to immediately add the AI agent right here, then you can already see that from the search, I already get 3 items, which would basically mean that I would pass on each and every one of those single files individually to the agent, right? So all of them would be passed onto the AI agent one by one. But that's not what I want, right? What I want is to have a complete list of all of those 3 or 30 items that are in there and to pass them all at once, at least in regards to their names or their descriptions, to the agent, right? So that it basically knows what it has access to. So what I need to do beforehand is to add an aggregate node before I add the agent. And I'm just going to look for aggregate. I'm going to open up this very node right here. And this will basically give you the option to, use individual fields from the nodes or from the variables beforehand. But this is also not really necessary. We are going to use all item data into a single list, which basically means that all of the data that we are receiving from the left-hand side, because these are only 2 parameters, right? We are going to aggregate into one list, and then we are going to pass it on to the agent itself. So if I click on execute step right here, then you can see that now on the right-hand side, I have an aggregated list and from the previous data that I have received before. And here you can see that before we had 3 items, right? And these are now all put into one data item. And you can see that this is now 1 item. I still have access to each and every one of those names, for instance, right? And this is exactly the same data that I have received from the left-hand side. And in the table view, you can see this better, that now I have those, or before I had these 3 items individually as separate items, right? These 3 rows. And now, after the aggregate node, I have bundled all of this into one data variable, and now I still have access to the same data, but I can now bundle it into one cohesive text. And now I'm going to close this, and now I'm basically prepared to add the agent, and this is exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to add an AI agent, as you can see here. I'm going to open this up, and the prompt itself will be coming from the chat input, which is correct. However, what I want to do within the options field down here in the dropdown is to adjust the system prompt, right? So what I'm going to choose is the system message down here, and which basically by default just says you are a helpful assistant, and I have prepared a system prompt which is obviously more detailed, and I'm going to paste this in here, and I'm going to open up the bigger view so that we can have a look. And here you can see that I'm telling it you are a helpful assistant still. Your capabilities and instructions for completing the tasks. The user asks, you are stored in skills files directory on a Google Drive, right? You will find a list of available skills in the according section below. And then I'm basically instructing it with the specific instructions in regards to the workflow. So which task should be done first and which should be done second and then third. And then on the bottom right here, you can see that I have already added the expression, right, which will be coming from the previous node. And this already might look like a little gibberish to you, but what I'm going to do is to close this one, and I'm going to switch from the fixed to the expression view so that we actually have access to the specific data that will be coming from the previous node. And I'm going to open this again so that you can have a better look into this. So this is now the raw prompt that I have added, right? And obviously you can see the left hand does not differ from the right hand side except for the parsing of this specific variable that I have added, right? And what I have done is to basically just grab the variable from the aggregate node just like so, as you can see now, right? So I have now added this, but what this gives me is, as you can see here, and I'm going to delete this for a second, is just to give me this object notation, right? And this is obviously not what I want. We want to have access to the according data behind this, right? Which is this one. Now there's a specific function that you can use, which is called the mapping function. And the way this map function works is that you are going going to put a period after the data field. And if I do this, I get a selection of all the available methods and functions within N8N. And then if I click on this, then you can see that by default, it gives me this syntax where it says item, and then we have this arrow sign and then another item. And what this basically does is that it creates a new array by applying a function to each element of the original array, right? And this might sound a little complicated, but at the end of the day, and you can see the result on the right-hand side already, it just basically means that you are able to kind of split out each and every one of those elements that you are retrieving from the previous node into, like a nicer structure, or into the structure that you would prefer. And in regards to the structure that I chose, you can see that what I did is just to put the term name and then a double colon and then a space before each and every one of those items. And you can see the result on the right-hand side, right? So this name, this syntax that you can see here is coming from this previous string that I have added into this specific function, right? And what this basically does is that it puts the term of name before each and every one of those individual items. Now, what you can even do then is to basically join the string that you receive out of this specific result back together again, and then add another parameter. And I have used the syntax of adding a new line, right, which is a backslash and then the letter N. So this might sound a little complicated right now, but the result, as you can see, is just that we have a nicer view of the structure that we are receiving from the previous node, right? So this is just an easier way how you can structure this. And the beauty of this is, and let me just delete this so that we can have a better look into the final result, that we now have a dynamic way of how many skills we are passing on to the agent's prompt, right? Because imagine that you now might have, as I've mentioned, 10 or 30 different items or skills files within that specific folder, right? And all the time you will pass that on to the agent within the specific prompt so that it's always able to retrieve the current list of available skills that it has, right? And this is a really elegant solution how you can basically equip your agent with the according skills. And now you can hopefully see the power of this approach, right? Because imagine that we would add all of this information, and as I've mentioned before, these are just 3 skills, right, into the system prompt itself. Then the system prompt would get longer and longer, and you would have this lost in the middle, phenomenon where it just forgets basically what it needs to do. And this way you have a really dedicated and specific way how you can give your agent those specific skills. All right, now let's close this and go on. So obviously we also need a model, and my personal approach is to use OpenRouter for this. And from my OpenRouter account, I am going to be able to choose this specific model. And I used, I think, Gemini 3 for this previously, which did give me quite good results. Let me just look for Gemini Flash or 3 Flash Preview. Yeah, that's completely sufficient for this specific use case. Let me just rename this to Gemini and then 3 Flash. And that's already it. I'm going to close this, and then we have our model. You can add a simple memory for this. This is fine for now. I'm not going to get into memory, into the memory function right now, or into the memory feature. I have a dedicated tutorial if you want to know more about this, how you can also give your agent long-term memory, right? And this will be sufficient for this specific case. So I'm just going to rename this to memory. That's also fine. I'm going to move this over here. And now it actually gets interesting, because what we want to do now is that we want the agent to be able to retrieve that specific skill, right? So the first step of its approach would be to look into the specific, folder. So where does the actual file lie? And after this, it will retrieve the file's content, right? This will be the actual approach. So we are going to pass on the search skill tool, if you will. So what I'm going to do is that I am going to use the search from Google Drive. So I have chosen Google Drive, and the credentials are obviously connected to my specific Google Drive. I will keep the tool description on automatically. That's fine. Then the resource I want to interact with will be a file, and what I want to do is I want it to be able to search for a file, or for a folder rather. So I'm going to switch this to file folder, and the operation will be search. Now again, I want to use the search method, search file and folder name, and then there will be the actual search query, right? So which query should the agent conduct to retrieve the specific file it wants to have access to, right? To that skill file that it needs to conduct the task. And in this case, what we are going to do is to use a simple trick, which is using this button right here, which is called let the model define this parameter. Because imagine this is now in this specific node, or in this specific field, this is now expecting the search term, i.e. in this case, the name of the specific file or folder we are looking for, right? However, we want the agent to decide which skill it needs and which skill it is supposed to get the content of, right, to conduct its specific task. So what we are going to do is to keep this dynamic. So I'm just going to click on this button, and then this input field will be disabled, and it will tell me it's going to be defined automatically by the model itself, right? And if I was to delete this or disable this again, then you can see what's happening behind the scenes. And there's a function which is called from AI, and I also have a dedicated tutorial about using this from AI function, and we're not going to get into too much detail right now, but just remember that this needs to be defined by the model itself, and we can just click on the specific button and the rest will be done by the agent itself. All right, so let me also just rename this to search skill files, and then the agent will know based on the actual name of the specific subnode of the specific tool, what this tool does. And then also it will take a look into the tool description so that it basically knows what tool does what, right? And remember, right, so this is, at the end of the day, the tool that it needs to get the specific skill file itself. Now, we now only gave it the possibility to look for this specific file, but now we actually wanted to retrieve the specific content, right? Now, what we need for this is to add a Google Docs node, so a Google Docs tool node. I'm going to select this. And the credentials are already connected to my Google Docs account. Description can be set automatically. The document or the resource that I want to interact with is a document, and the operation will be to get the document, right? Now, again, what ID or URL do I actually need to put in here so that it retrieves the correct document, right? The content of the correct document. And this is now also going to be defined by the model itself, right? So what we can do is to click on the same button again. So let the model define this parameter. And what I do, just to make sure that the model actually knows exactly what we are expecting in this specific field, I'm going to add a description. And the description is going to refer to this specific input field, right? Because it is going to be defined by the model. And the one that I have prepared is use the ID from the Google Drive search tool to retrieve the correct skills document, right? And this is something that it needs to actually retrieve the content of the document itself. All right, so that is actually already it. So if I close this, then now you can see, let me just close this right here. So then now you can see I'm going to also rename this. So I'm going to call this get skill file. And this is the difference, right? So we're going to search for the skill file, and then we're going to actually get the one that it needs, right? And now you can see that this is basically already it. So this is now the setup that we have to basically mimic the concept of Anthropic's skill, right? So let's actually test this. So I'm going to open up the chat in the bottom corner, and then I'm going to paste in, or actually let me just reset the chat session, and then we can start from fresh. And then I'm going to paste in this very prompt. So write a LinkedIn post about why giant system prompts hurt your AI agent's performance, right? So according to the topic, I've prepared this specific prompt. All right, so let's just see what happens. I'm going to send this. And now I retrieved an error, which makes sense because let me just open this up, and now you can actually see what the problem is. It claims that there is no prompt specified. And if we take a look into the actual prompt that it received, it says it is undefined, which is strange, right? Because we have defined that the prompt should be coming from the connected chat trigger node. And if I close this, then there is this chat trigger node, right? We have this on the canvas, but the problem is that it is not the immediately previous node, right? So that the variable that we are using right here does not match with the previous structure. So what I need to do is to switch the source for the prompt to define below, and then I actually, like I would do usually, use the chat input variable from the chat trigger node again. And then if I paste this into the actual prompt message, then now you can see that it is retrieving my current prompt, right? And again, the problem is that, let me just close this for a second. The problem is that this is not connected. So the AI agent is not directly connected to the chat trigger node, but we have those two nodes in between, right? And this is basically hurting the reference of the variable that is put in here by default. So I need to switch to define below, and then I'm able just to get the chat input variable, and then it should function as normal. All right, so let me repeat this. I'm going to put in the prompt again. And now you can see that it actually did search the files, and it also did get the file. And when we take a look into the logs right here, then you can see that it did adhere to the flow that I told it to, right? To the instructions that I told it to within the system prompt, that it's supposed to first of all check the search skill files, right? So to get that specific skill file it needs, right? It supposedly needs to answer the specific prompt, and then it actually did get the content of that specific file. So let's take a look into the file that it chose, and here you can actually actually see that it was looking for, right, the LinkedIn post writer.md. And this obviously makes sense because I told it that I wanted to have a LinkedIn post, right? So based on the available skills that are here, neither the YouTube to newsletter nor the client update email skill would have made sense, right? But the LinkedIn post writer does make sense. So this is perfectly fine. And now you can also see why we used the let the model define this parameter itself option, right? If you remember this one click that we used, because it is now able to retrieve the exact document based on the file names that we provided it with beforehand, right? So it knows exactly what to look for, and then it is able to get the ID and get the specific location of the document, and then it is actually able to also retrieve that data from within that document, i.e. this skill right here, right? So the content of this specific document right here, and then it is perfectly equipped with this specific skill, obviously, right, that it is supposed to adhere to, and then it will conduct that task. And by the way, let's obviously also take a look into the results. So let's see, this is the post. Giant system prompts are the silent killers of AI performance. And if I jump back into the structure, then you can see that the post structure is to contain a hook, which is one single sentence, no more, right? And this is what we have right here. Then the second point would be to use short paragraphs, maximum 2 sentences each, one idea per paragraph, use line breaks generously. And if we take a look into the body, then you can see that these are all quite short. There is only one sentence, line breaks after each and every one of those. So white space is used quite generously. Take away lines, summarize the core lessons in 1 to 2 sentences, and complexity breeds hallucination. And yeah, so obviously this is a matter of interpretation, and we can tweak this further, right? But in general, you can see that it actually did adhere to the specific structure. Perfect. As you can see, this has worked quite well. And as I've mentioned before, this can get quite technical if you take a look into the actual document, right, which you can take as a reference. And this is obviously specific for or specifically for Claude, right, or Claude Code. But at the end of the day, we are able to replicate or simulate the whole concept, right, to having specific skills in regards to a specific area, and to implement this within N8N. And it, as you can see, is quite simple to do. All right. Thanks a lot for your attention. I hope this was helpful. Hope to see you next time, and see ya. Bye.